This week we're talking about Luke 1. There are two big stories in Luke 1. There are two miraculous births. Two things that don't happen naturally, normally in nature, especially. You don't have a lot of angels just showing up out of nowhere. But in these two stories they do, and there's important reasons why. So the first story is the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah and Elizabeth are an old couple. They both come from a very important family in the life of Israel. The sons of Aaron, sons and daughters of Aaron. And they watch over the temple, one of the most important building in all of Israel. Zechariah was serving that week by lighting the incense. This is a major part of temple worship, in part because it was back before there were showers, and back before there was good hygiene, and the sacrifices wouldn't always smell very good. So Zechariah's in there, and he's burning his incense, and a little background on Zechariah and Elizabeth is important. Zechariah and Elizabeth are old. They're old enough that they can't have kids anymore. It's not a possibility. But they don't have any kids. They didn't have any when they were younger because they weren't able. And in this culture at this time, not having children is basically looked at as God's way of saying you're a bad person. The idea was that if you had some sickness or some malady, there was something wrong with you, that was probably because you deserved it. That God wouldn't let you have kids because those are really important and He didn't trust you with them. People are always looking at them like, why does God not like you? I imagine all the other priests with all their kids were always a little uncomfortable around Zechariah and Elizabeth. They were kind of outcasts. They were allowed to perform the function because they were from the right family. But they probably never really fit in, and they felt that. They were ashamed that they couldn't have any kids. So for years and years they had prayed about it. Well, snap to this day in the temple, and Zechariah is going through and he's lighting the incense. And I imagine it was pretty quiet. This is one of the interior parts of the temple, so there wouldn't be a lot of people moving around. And all of a sudden, there's an angel. Just out of nowhere, a massive angel comes and speaks to Zechariah and greets him by name. Tells Zechariah, your prayers have been heard, and you're going to have a child. And he says very importantly to him, do not be afraid. Zechariah looks at him and says, how can I know that this is going to happen? Well, it's kind of the wrong question. The angel kind of bows up and says, I'm Gabriel, God's messenger. Because you doubted what I had to say, your proof that you were looking for is going to be that you're going to be silent until this child is born. Gabriel said to Zechariah, your son will be like Elijah. Elijah is this crucial Old Testament figure that we'll talk about sometime. But the most important thing for his day about Elijah was that Elijah was promised to come before the Messiah, before the new covenant, before the time when everything would change. Elijah would come. So when the angel tells Zechariah that your son is the embodiment of Elijah, this is a very big deal. Flash forward 6 months, and another person has a run-in with an angel. This woman's name is Mary. She's young, she's single, she's not part of the priesthood, and she's at her home. When the angel appears to her and says, greetings, favored one, which is kind of creepy if you think about it. What does it mean when an angel just shows up and says that you're favored? It's kind of a frightening thing. And yet again, the angel says to her, just like he said to Zechariah, do not be afraid. And she says, what kind of greeting is this? And the angel explains that she's going to have a son. And his name is going to be Jesus. And he's going to change everything. But she's kind of concerned because she's never been with a man. She's a virgin. And she's supposed to be getting married soon. But the way this angel's talking, this isn't like, oh, you're going to have a kid after you get married and all this. He's talking in the immediate tense. So she says, how can this be? Because I've never been with a man. And the angel explains that God is going to perform a miracle and give her a child out of nothing. And that she'll be remembered for the rest of history as the mother of Jesus. A single mother in this day and age, a single mother walking down the streets of Orlando, is going to experience an enormous amount of difficulty. There's going to be people judging her. She's going to have a harder time making a go of it by herself. You know, people are going to say things and do things and ignore her, and her child's going to suffer, and she's going to feel guilty for that. In Mary's time, though, a single mother could be stoned to death. Adultery back then was a capital offense if you got caught. And a child is pretty hard to not get caught with. So in Mary's story, there's some crazy stuff going on. Because on the one hand, God is willing to risk Mary's life to bring his son into the world. To make sure that people understand that this is special and unique and different from anyone else. God's doing something crazy, but necessarily when he does that, there's an enormous risk. But Mary's response is incredible because she knows the risk that she's taking. She may have even known people in her own village who had suffered the penalty of adultery. She may have seen it with her own eyes. But instead of complaining, instead of objecting, instead of saying, God, this is too much, I can't do this, I'm going to get in legal trouble, people are going to judge me and look down on me, her response is simply, let it be to me as you have said. There's a really important piece of this you need to understand. Jewish poetry doesn't use word rhymes the way English poetry does. In English, we would say, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. In Hebrew poetry, that line would be something more like, roses are red, violets are blue, you are beautiful, and you capture my eye. It doesn't rhyme, and it's not meant to, but you parallel the idea of the beauty of the flower, 2 lines, and the beauty of a person in 2 lines. That repetition is a form of poetry. So when you read Luke and you understand that he's writing to a bunch of people who are part of the Hebrew culture, you can start to see that he uses some of these tools. When he tells the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then he follows it with the story of Mary, he's not doing that just because, oh, well, you know, 2 birth stories, we'll lump them together. He's making some parallels because he wants to highlight some differences. See, every biblical author has a different idea about how they should write. They have their own style, they have their own focus. And Luke is known for writing what some have called the upside-down gospel. In Luke's gospel, many of the things that we would take for granted are turned on their head, so that women are featured in a way that very few other texts from that age are featured. The poor are talked about. The rich are questioned. The powerful are criticized. So in this story, Luke has told us these 2 sides of a coin. He's told us these 2 reactions and these 2 responses. Zechariah is a trained, professional, religious person. Zechariah has lived his whole life in and out of the temple, around the religion. He knows all the rules. He's old. He's practiced. He knows how to do the right thing and do all the things that the law says. Yet when the angel approaches him, his reaction is, oh yeah? Prove it. His reaction is self-centered. See, it's important that they both asked questions. There's nothing wrong with questions. There are questions all throughout the Bible, some of which are unanswered. Questions are important. It's how we ask them that separates the good from the bad. When Zechariah asked his question, he made it about himself. He said, how can I know this? How can I be sure? As if him being sure would make something true or not. Things that are true, no matter who believes them. That applies in all areas of life. Mary's question is different. Mary has a question, but her question is almost more a scientific one. She says, how can this happen? Not that I need to prove it to me, but how is that even possible? And the angel explains to her, you're right, it's basically impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Her question was about how. Zechariah's question was really about himself. Mary is a single woman who's going to be taking on risk, confusion, let alone the regular pains of pregnancy. And yet her response is faithful. Her response is to say, let's see how we can get it done. Zechariah is old and supposedly wise. He's professionally religious. He knows all the rules. He knows all the scriptures. But when he's asked the question, he responds out of selfishness and self-centeredness. There are two goals in life: to love God and love others. So every time we do this, I'd like to tell you one way that God loves you, and I'd like to challenge you with the way you can love others. In both of these situations, God is turning the judgment of other people on its head. When people were looking at Zechariah and Elizabeth and judging them for not having a child, God removed their shame. He gave them a child. Not just any child, but a child who was going to change the world. For Mary, people looked at her and said, well, you're not worth anything until you're married. Women in that day and time generally weren't looked at as being all that valuable. Women were only valuable in how good you could marry them off. Maybe you could make a good business deal with them, or maybe you could, get a political alliance going. But women by themselves were kind of like, horses and cows. They were livestock to a lot of people in that time. But God says Mary had value above, beyond, and before she was wed to a man. That she herself was holy, that she herself was capable. God looked at what the world was saying about these people and said, that's not how I see it. So God looks at you, and he sees you, and he says, I don't care what that kid at school said. I don't care what your parents say. I don't care what that teacher says. I don't care what that judge says. You are my child. You are valuable. You have gifts, and you're worth it. Now our challenge for how we can love our neighbors and our enemies better is right there as well. Because we are the judgers so often. The church, the one thing that's most synonymous with church is that people are judgmental. The church has gone out of its way to set up rules, to set up new bars for people to jump over and hoops for them to jump through. We need to ask ourselves, not only how are we being judgmental, but more importantly, how are we going out of our way to protect others from judgment, to stand with them when others would say that God doesn't love them, or that other people don't love them, or that they're not worthy of love. So this week, look for ways to love people who are shamed. Look for ways to love people that other people say aren't worth it.